Question number 12, Kevin Hague.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he agree with the Prime Minister that there is not a housing crisis in New Zealand?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I thank the member for his question and note for his benefit that the GDP figure was 3.5% over last year.
Just answer the question.
Mr Speaker, I do agree with the Prime Minister. There is certainly a shortage of housing supply in one part of New Zealand, which of course is Auckland, which is why we are agreeing a range of things with Auckland and encouraging the increase in consenting of houses and apartments and so on over 3 years. But I'd point out to the member that for the rest of New Zealand, taken as a whole, there's actually been no increase in the median house price over the last year. And in addition, mortgage interest rates are very low. So we have a localised challenge in Auckland around house and land supply, but the rest of the country actually there is not a housing crisis at all. And to describe New Zealand as being in housing crisis for Auckland is, I think, a little hyperbole.
Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
Does the Minister accept that an average median house sale price in Auckland last year of $621,800 and an average median household income for Aucklanders aged 20 to 34 of just $48,600 mean that it is almost impossible for most young Aucklanders to buy a house now and will be even more so in the future given the way house prices are rising?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare the price of houses for the whole of a city and then look at a small subset of the buying population and suggest that those two are directly comparable. But nevertheless, we know there are challenges in the housing market in Auckland, but I can report to the member the good news, which is there has been a very significant increase in consents granted and construction commenced in Auckland. I myself was flying over Auckland just the other day. I look at projects like Millwater, which is being built for 10,000 people. I look at the big apartment complexes being built in Albany and in the central city. I look at the Whenuapai and Hobsonville projects. I look at what's happening in Tamaki, and actually there's very, very big investment, and that's only one part of Auckland and its growth.
Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When will he tell the 82.8% of Aucklanders aged 20 to 34 who did not own their own home at the last census that it is unlikely that they ever will?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, with the greatest respect, I don't know that you can actually suggest that would happen at all. Somebody who's at the age of 20 is not necessarily as likely as somebody who's significantly older to own their own home. And the key about actually increasing home ownership in Auckland is to provide more options for people to start out in their first home. I've mentioned some for the member: Millwater, Hobsonville, Whenuapai, Albany, Long Bay, Grafton, Mangere, Tamaki, Weymouth. There's a lot of investment being made in house construction.
I apologise to the Minister.
The Minister is repeating the same speech he gave in answer to the previous supplementary.
Order. That is for me as the Speaker to decide when the Minister's gone.
Sir.
Well, the point of order, the response to that, I'm saying to the member, I'll determine when I've decided the answer's gone on for too long. It's not the prerogative of the member. Does he have a further supplementary?
Mr Speaker, I do, but a point of order, sir.
Further point of order, or are we relitigating?
Requesting clarification of your ruling, sir. Are you ruling that, in fact, that members may not take a point of order to point out that a minister is, in fact, giving a speech?
I'm suggesting to the member that such a point of order will lead to disorder. It is my job to adjudicate the question time in this House. I will determine when an answer is going on for too long. Towards the end of that answer, we were listing a whole lot of suburbs that had been listed. That is a fair point. But the first part of the The answer, I thought, was a genuine attempt by the Minister, to address the question that was asked by the member. Supplementary question, Kevin Hague.
If, in his opinion, there is not a housing crisis, despite the lowest home ownership rates nationally since 1951 and plummeting house affordability in our largest city, what specific signs should New Zealanders look for to know that we might be in a housing crisis in the future?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, for better or worse, we've had declining home ownership in New Zealand, as the member points out, for a very, very, very long time, which suggests that there is actually a change in the approach that some people are taking to housing, something like 60 years. And there is definitely opportunities and definitely challenges in Auckland in housing, but to suddenly call it a crisis when you've seen something happening over 65 years or thereabouts sounds at the least politically convenient. The real challenge in Auckland is to boost supply of housing, new housing in that city, and as I have said a number of times for the member this afternoon, I'm happy to list it again, but I suspect the Speaker doesn't need to hear them.
No, I certainly do not.
There is significant developments right across Auckland and very high and growing levels of consents and construction.
What a load of rubbish.
Point of order, the Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to make a personal explanation correcting an answer I gave to a supplementary question in oral question 4 today.
Leave is sought for that. A course of action. Is there any objection? There is not. The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
In an answer to a supplementary question, I indicated that police decisions around the laying charges as a consequence of Operation Clover were taken following advice from the Solicitor General. I should have said that that advice had come from the Crown Solicitor.
I thank the Minister. That concludes questions for oral answer. I have received a letter from Carmel Sepuloni seeking to debate under Standing Order 389 the release of the report by the Independent Police